Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
Alistair arrived home late in the evening after a long business trip, exhausted but relieved to be back. His wife Becca, whom he'd started calling Becca ever since their college days, greeted him with a soft smile. She looked a bit different to him tonight, more vibrant, more eager, and somehow a little more something else. He brushed it off, chalking it up to his tired eyes playing tricks after too many hours in airport terminals. Alistair, honey, I have some news, Becca said, her smile almost shy, her eyes sparkling in a way that felt a little out of place. Alistair noticed it, but pushed the feeling aside. I'm pregnant, she whispered. Alistair froze for a moment, the words hanging in the air longer than they should have, like an echo. He wasn't quite ready for this, but he quickly pulled himself together, offering her a reassuring nod and a warm hug. He told himself to act happy, even though the news settled heavily on his chest. That's wonderful, Becca, he murmured softly. Becca held his hand a little tighter, her excitement bubbling over. We're going to have twins, Alistair, she added, her eyes wide with joy. The word twins landed on Alistair's heart like a stone, making everything feel heavier than it already was. He forced a smile, nodding along as Becca excitedly talked about doctor visits, due dates, and everything that felt so distant to him. He was supposed to feel joy, but all he could manage was a hollow acceptance and a weak attempt to mirror her enthusiasm. Before long, she was onto something else. Oh, and we'll need to have one of those big gender reveal parties, with fun contests and games. Doesn't that sound fun? She bounced with excitement, her eyes sparkling even brighter. Alistair, still trying to mask his weariness, offered a tired but dutiful reply. Sure, whatever you want, Becca. Just then, their young son Billy, who had been quietly listening, perked up at the mention of a party. A party? He asked, his face lighting up at the thought of games and fun. Alistair smiled at Billy, ruffling his hair, but the nagging feeling that had been bothering him lingered. He watched his son, seeing him through a different lens now. Alistair spent some time with Billy, listening to the boy excitedly chat about the party ideas Becca had mentioned. Yet, even as he tried to engage, his mind was elsewhere, tangled in a web of suspicion and dread that he couldn't shake off. Becca's news had only confirmed something Alistair had feared for months. He knew too much already. For months, he'd been uncovering Becca's secrets that had slowly begun to unravel the foundation of their family. Now, with the news of twins hanging in the air, Alistair realized he could no longer ignore the truth. Their family was at a crossroads, and it felt like he was standing alone, watching the road split before him. A few days later, Alistair found himself heading back to the airport, preparing for another business trip. The rhythm of his life had long been defined by work trips, long flights, hotel rooms with stale air, and the sight of unfamiliar cities under hazy morning skies. For years, he hadn't worried about what was happening back home. He had trusted Becca completely, believing their marriage was built on love and honesty. But as he settled into his seat on the plane, an unfamiliar weight pressed down on his chest. It was a feeling that had slowly crept in over the past few months, a quiet, bitter unease. Alistair had never been the type to question Becca's loyalty. He loved her, after all, and she was the mother of his son. But now, little details that he had brushed off before kept returning, pulling at him with an insistent, nagging persistence. He opened his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys before reluctantly clicking on a folder. It wasn't his usual collection of work files or spreadsheets. No, this folder contained something he had kept hidden, even from himself, like a bad dream he wasn't ready to confront. Alistair began scrolling, his eyes scanning the familiar screen, taking in the images that played out silently before him. But instead of the satisfaction he had hoped for, a hollow, sickening sadness washed over him as he continued. The videos only intensified his unease, stirring up a strange, unexpected anger that he had long kept buried, trying to pretend it wasn't there. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning back in his seat, trying to shake the sense of betrayal that seemed to be seeping deeper into his bones with each passing second. His mind wandered, and suddenly, an image of Timothy, his neighbor, popped into his thoughts. Timothy, with his easygoing smile, and the way he'd come over to help Alistair clear the yard last summer without a second thought. Timothy, who was always quick with a joke, a pat on the back, and a warm, friendly laugh. Could someone really be that good, that warm, that open, without hiding something beneath the surface? The thought left a bitter taste in Alistair's mouth, and he couldn't shake it. People can be chameleons, he reminded himself. People can put on masks, especially those you trust the most. That uncertainty was what unsettled him, the possibility that he'd been deceived. Everything kept circling back to one thing, one unavoidable truth that haunted him. Even as the plane cut through the clouds, high above a world he suddenly felt disconnected from, Alistair knew what was coming next. He had to be ready for the party Becca had planned, the grand gender reveal event she was so excited about. She told him it would be an unforgettable celebration, one their friends and family would remember for years. But as Alistair gazed out at the gray sky beyond his window, he knew that for him, this party wouldn't be about balloons or colored confetti. No, he'd be preparing for something else entirely. He wanted to end it all, to tear down the fragile facade he and Becca had been living behind, to finally face the truth that had been gnawing at him. He felt trapped, caged in by the lies, but he couldn't act on it just yet. He needed time to get his affairs in order. There was too much at stake, and if Alistair acted now, he'd risk losing more than just his peace of mind. For the first time, he found himself questioning the things he had once taken for granted about his family, even his little boy, Billy. At only 6 years old, Billy's heart and eyes were pure, and the last thing Alistair wanted was for him to be caught in the middle of a storm he never asked for. So Alistair would bide his time, hold on to his suspicions, and quietly build a path toward freedom, a way to walk away from the life he had once loved, with his head held high and his assets intact. The weeks dragged on, each one feeling like a strange mix of resentment, patience, and small preparations. Becca was completely absorbed in the pregnancy, planning every detail of the twins' arrival with a level of excitement that, in a different world, would have been contagious. She chattered endlessly about cribs and baby clothes, about how much fun the gender reveal party would be, never noticing the change in Alistair. She didn't see how his once open gaze had turned calculating, how he had begun staying up late at night, not for work, but to gather everything he would need for the life he was planning to build on his own terms. Alistair played the role of the devoted husband, keeping up appearances while meticulously preparing for the life he was about to live alone. He met with his lawyer in secret, made careful adjustments to his finances, and arranged a modest, quiet living situation away from all the pretense. He even found time to investigate matters concerning Billy, a process that kept him awake with worry. As the months slipped by, Alistair became a master of patience. He'd smile on cue, laugh at the right times. But beneath it all, a growing resolve took root. Finally, the day arrived, the day of the grand gender reveal. Their backyard was transformed, with colorful tables, flower arrangements, and banners welcoming guests that surrounded the lawn. Friends and family mingled, and Becca, glowing with joy, wore a radiant smile. The guests lined up for food, exchanging predictions about whether the babies would be boys or girls. Alistair moved through the crowd quietly, his face serious, his thoughts miles away from the idle chatter around him. He wore his best suit, a sharp one he hadn't worn in years, and it fit him with the same precision that matched the look in his eyes. His gaze landed on Timothy, who was laughing with another neighbor near the refreshments, and Alistair's mind went cold. Alistair's gaze lingered a moment longer on Timothy, who caught his eye and flashed a friendly smile. Alistair chose not to return the gesture today. He didn't need to pretend anymore. Standing tall, Alistair scanned the scene before him like a hawk, feeling the weight of months filled with secrets and quiet resolve. The moment he had been preparing for had arrived, the moment that would free him from the tangled mess his life had become. As Becca, practically glowing, stepped up to the small platform they'd set up in the backyard, she called for everyone's attention, her smile wide and bright. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate this special day with us," she began, scanning the crowd of friends, family, and neighbors. "Family means everything to us, and with our 2 little ones on the way, we're so excited to start this new chapter together. So, we thought a fun contest would make today even more special." The crowd clapped eagerly, anticipating the grand reveal. In the center of the platform, a large balloon hovered, filled with either pink or blue confetti. Becca turned to Alistair, her eyes filled with expectation. He took a deep breath, the weight of the past few months pressing down on him, but he managed to maintain his composure. "Before we get to the big moment," Alistair said, raising a hand to quiet the crowd, "I'd like to give my wife a small gift." Becca looked surprised, caught off guard, but smiled, likely thinking it was just another sweet gesture to add to the day's excitement. Alistair handed her a beautifully wrapped box, the ribbon tied neatly, the paper bright and colorful, almost cheerful, in contrast to the heavy, stony look in his eyes. The crowd fell silent, curious to see what this gift was all about. Becca opened the box slowly, her smile faltering as she peeled back the paper and lifted the lid. Inside, there were 2 stacks of papers. The first was thick, stamped with the unmistakable words, "Divorce Papers" at the top. The second was thinner but no less devastating, bearing the title, "DNA Test Results," with Alistair and Billy's names printed in bold. The color drained from Becca's face as she pulled the papers from the box, struggling to understand what she was holding. The guests around them began murmuring, confusion spreading like wildfire. The atmosphere froze, everyone waiting for an explanation that hung in the air, unspoken. Alistair turned to face the crowd, his voice cutting through the silence, firm and unwavering. "I shouldn't be the one standing here," he said, his tone hard. "These future twins, this big reveal, it's not for me. It's for Timothy." He pointed to the neighbor standing awkwardly near the back, drink still in hand. "Timothy should be up here. He should be the one popping this balloon." The crowd gasped. Heads turned to Timothy, who looked as though he'd just been struck by lightning. His face went pale, and his eyes widened in disbelief. His wife, standing beside him, went rigid, her hand gripping her glass so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Becca, still reeling, stared at Alistair, tears welling up in her eyes. Her voice trembled as she barely whispered, "Alistair, these are divorce papers and a DNA test. What's going on? Why are you doing this?" Alistair met her gaze, his eyes filled with cold determination that had been building for months. "Becca," he replied, his voice low but clear, "I know more than you think. I know about the secret life you've been leading, the lies you've been feeding me all while I was working hard for our family. And as for how I found out, well, it's all right there, in black and white. I did what I had to do. Billy and I deserve the truth." The guests exchanged stunned glances, their whispers growing louder as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The weight of the betrayal hung over the crowd like a dark cloud, and an almost surreal silence fell over the yard as everyone processed what had just happened. Becca, still clutching the divorce papers and DNA results, looked as if her entire world had shattered in her hands. She blinked, her lips parted, too stunned to speak as Alistair stood tall, unsmiling, waiting for the silence to become almost unbearable. With a deep, calm breath, Alistair spoke again, his voice steady. "Well, Becca, why don't we get back to what you planned?" He nodded toward the black balloon hovering above them. "Everyone's waiting for the big reveal. After all." Becca, wide-eyed and trembling, just stared, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. Alistair stepped forward, addressing the crowd with a weary authority. "You know, it's funny how life works. While I was busy working hard, planning for a future with my wife and son, my loyal wife was out there, let's say, having some adventures in the arms of another man." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the shocked crowd. "I could show you all the footage from the cameras I installed at home," he continued, his tone unwavering, "but dear guests, I'd rather spare you from those, let's just say, less than clean videos. You don't need to see the details to understand what's been going on." Gasps rippled through the crowd. People exchanged glances, some muttering in disbelief, while others stood frozen in stunned silence. Becca's friends covered their mouths, their expressions a mix of shock and confusion. Becca herself was breathing heavily, her face a twisted mix of horror and humiliation. "But that's not even the worst part," Alistair said, his voice growing colder. He looked directly at Becca, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "The worst part is that all of this led me to question things I never wanted to question. I did a DNA test with my son, Billy," Alistair said, pausing as the weight of his words sank into the crowd. "It turns out, Billy isn't my child." Becca shook her head frantically, her face turning bright red with a mix of anger and disbelief. "No, Alistair, no. This is insane," she sputtered, her voice rising to a near scream. "What kind of sick joke is this? Billy is your son, and these babies, they're yours too." But her words faltered, the conviction quickly dissolving into guilt and pain that was written all over her face. Alistair shook his head, unmoved. "I don't know who Billy's father is, Becca. Maybe it's Timothy. But what I do know for certain is that Timothy is the father of these twins." The crowd went silent. The shock of Alistair's revelation hung heavily in the air. All eyes turned to Timothy, who stood pale and stiff, his mouth agape in disbelief. His wife, standing beside him, looked at him with a mix of shock, hurt, and raw fury. Alistair waved to the crowd casually, as if this were just another farewell. "For those of you who want more details, you're welcome to join me at divorce court. he said, his voice steady and resolute. But for me, it's time to move on. Time for a new life, one without the lies and betrayal. Whispers erupted among the guests as Alistair took one last look around the yard. Becca, unable to hold back any longer, burst into tears, her voice rising into frantic, panicked shouts. No, this is all a lie, Alistair. You can't believe this. I am your wife. I've been faithful. This is just a sick misunderstanding. She stumbled toward him, clutching the papers in her hands, pleading. Alistair, Becca shouted, but he didn't turn around. He simply moved toward the gate, determined and resolute. Timothy, fuming with anger, stepped forward to intercept him. Alistair, come on. We need to talk. You can't just walk away, he hissed, reaching out to stop him. Alistair didn't break his pace. With a simple sidestep, he tripped Timothy, sending him sprawling to the ground. Looking down at him, Alistair's voice was low but unwavering. You're not my neighbor, Timothy. You're not my friend. You're just another traitor, like Becca. I have nothing more to say to you. Without a second glance, Alistair stepped over Timothy and made his way to his car. The crowd parted as he walked through them. Once inside, he took one final look at the stunned faces around him, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway, leaving behind the gasps, whispers, and the shattered pieces of his past. No one knew where he was going. Only Alistair knew that he was driving toward a future that would finally be his. In the months leading up to the divorce, Alistair carefully planned to protect his money and assets. He worked with financial experts and lawyers who helped him set up strategies to keep everything safe from Becca. Alistair knew she would try to claim as much as she could, so he made sure there would be nothing left for her to take. First, Alistair transferred ownership of his home into a family trust. This made it legally difficult for Becca to claim it. He also moved all his bank accounts, investments, and retirement funds into accounts under the trust's name, so they were off-limits to her. He then took steps to protect other valuable items. He sold these assets and moved the money into an offshore account in a country with strict privacy laws, making it nearly impossible for anyone to find or access. To make things even more complicated for Becca, Alistair set up multiple companies under different names and moved some of his money into these businesses. This made it harder for anyone to link the businesses to him personally. Alistair also transferred his stocks and shares into companies that were separate from his name. This way, Becca couldn't directly trace them back to him. He even moved some of his money into cryptocurrency, which is much harder to track or steal. Alistair's lawyer helped him set up everything in a way that would be very difficult for Becca to uncover. When the divorce began, Alistair knew that Becca wouldn't be able to touch any of his assets. His money was safe, and he had done everything he could to make sure she couldn't get her hands on it. The steps he took were his way of protecting himself and ensuring that his hard work wasn't wasted. Alistair entered the courthouse with a quiet confidence, knowing he was well prepared and several steps ahead of his soon-to-be ex-wife. He had taken every precaution to protect what was rightfully his, and no matter what Becca or her lawyer tried, they wouldn't be able to touch his hard-earned assets. As the proceedings began, Alistair presented his evidence, and the courtroom fell silent. Along with the divorce papers, he submitted hours of video footage captured by hidden cameras he'd installed throughout their home. The footage clearly showed Becca and Timothy, laughing, whispering, and embracing each other in intimate spaces that should have been sacred to him. One clip caught Becca softly giggling as she leaned into Timothy, her hands on his chest. "I can't believe we're finally free to do this," Becca whispered, her voice low but unmistakable. Timothy, smiling, replied, "I know, Becca. It's been worth the wait." The camera captured them sneaking into a bedroom, oblivious to the fact that Alistair had been at work, sacrificing time with his family to provide for them. Alistair's voice was steady as he recounted his years of hard work, his tone unwavering. "While I was out there, working to provide for my family, my wife was home, finding comfort in the arms of another man," he said, his words cutting through the courtroom. The judge watched intently as the footage continued, Becca's face frozen in guilt and disbelief. The room was thick with tension as Alistair's account painted a picture of betrayal. With a final glance at Becca, Alistair turned his focus to the judge. "This is not just about a broken marriage," he continued. "It's about the years I spent away from my family, working to build a life, only to return and find that life shattered by deceit." The judge's face tightened as he watched the footage, his eyes narrowing with each passing second. Becca, sitting at the table, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She couldn't bring herself to meet anyone's gaze. Her hands trembled as the truth played out in front of the court. When the twins were born, Becca and Timothy's hopes of a future together crumbled. A DNA test had confirmed what Alistair had suspected all along. Timothy wasn't just the father of the twins, but also of Billy, the young boy Alistair had raised as his own. The revelation hit the courtroom like a hammer, the weight of the betrayal crashing down on everyone present. Alistair's voice rang out, steady and calm. "It's a 6-year affair that spanned nearly half of our marriage," he said, his gaze unwavering as he looked at Becca. "The timeline is crystal clear, and there's no denying the depth of the deceit. This wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated, ongoing betrayal." Becca, still struggling to keep it together, whispered, "Alistair, please, you don't understand?" But Alistair shook his head, his expression cold. "I understand perfectly." As the judge processed the evidence, Timothy sat across from him, pale and stiff. The man who had once shared jokes and casual conversations with Alistair over the backyard fence was now facing his own fate in a courtroom. Later, in a courtroom of his own, Timothy's life came crashing down. His wife, upon learning the truth, had filed for divorce without hesitation. "I had no choice," she said, looking at Timothy with a mix of anger and pity. "The truth was right there in front of me, and I can't stand to live a lie." As the courtroom grew tense, Becca tried to regain some control, her voice shaky but determined. She turned to Alistair, her face twisted in desperation. "Alistair, you have to understand," she said, her eyes welling up with false tears. "Billy needs you. You're all he's ever known as a father. I'll have to tell him that you abandoned him. How can you do that to a child?" Alistair stood motionless, his gaze unwavering. He could feel the crowd's judgment, but he kept his focus on the judge. The judge, who had been silent up until this point, cleared his throat before speaking. His voice was firm, with a hint of disdain. "Mrs. Jones," he said, addressing Becca, "the truth is that Billy's biological father is not Mr. Jones, but Timothy. Your attempts to manipulate the situation are transparent, and they will not sway this court. Billy will remain with his biological parents moving forward. I should be penalizing you for a parental fraud, but it was Mr. Jones' kindness that he does not want to drag the matter and be done with you. Looking at your behavior, I can understand why he is so kind, or I should say he just does not want to be around you." Becca's face flushed red with embarrassment, but she didn't stop. "But—" The judge cut her off sharply. "It doesn't matter what lies you feed the child. It's his reality, and you are the creator of this reality. He'll be with his mother and his biological father, and there will be no emotional and financial obligation for Mr. Jones for this child." Becca's expression faltered as the judge continued, his words growing harsher. "You've shown yourself to be a poor role model for your children," the judge said, his eyes narrowing. "A mother who is more concerned with maintaining her false narrative than with the well-being of her kids. That's not a situation I take lightly." Becca opened her mouth to protest, but the judge didn't give her a chance. "To make matters clearer, CPS will be visiting the children every fortnight to monitor their mental growth until they turn 16. They will ensure that there is no attempt to manipulate the children, especially Billy. Any further attempts to undermine their emotional stability will result in them being taken from you and placed into foster care." The courtroom was dead silent now, everyone watching Becca, who was clearly struggling to keep her composure. She looked down, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I didn't mean. I just wanted to make it right," she muttered, her voice small and broken. "You've had your chances, Mrs. Jones," the judge said, his tone final. "The court has spoken. Now, focus on being a mother to your children, and stop trying to rewrite the truth." Alistair could feel a weight lifting off his shoulders as he glanced at Becca one last time, his face steady. For the first time in a long while, he felt like justice was on his side. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he was free to rebuild his life, no longer tangled in the web of lies Becca had spun. Timothy, who once joked with Alistair about mundane things, now sat in silence, absorbing the weight of his own actions. The court awarded his wife nearly everything, including a hefty alimony check. The man who once laughed in Alistair's presence was now left with nothing. No family, no future, and no peace. After the proceedings, Alistair turned to leave the courthouse, feeling a sense of finality. He had faced the truth, presented it to the world, and walked out of the courtroom with his dignity intact. He had known for a long time that the road ahead would be difficult, but now, at last, he had the freedom to rebuild his life, free from the lies that had once bound him. Now, Timothy was left with the daunting responsibility of raising 3 children and managing support payments he could never afford. Becca and Timothy were left with nothing but each other and a mountain of debt, alimony obligations, and the overwhelming challenge of raising their children without the security or trust they once took for granted. For Alistair, the outcome was everything he had hoped for. He walked out of the trial with his assets intact and his dignity restored. He had faced the truth and ensured he wouldn't be deceived any longer. The people in the courtroom saw through Becca's defenses, her attempts to portray herself as a misunderstood woman caught in an uncontrollable situation. The undeniable truth came to light, and Becca was left to face the consequences of the choices she made, whether intentional or impulsive, all those years ago. With the final judgment in his favor, Alistair took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling lighter than he had in years. The weight of suspicion, heartbreak, and betrayal had been lifted. He wasn't the blindsided husband. He was the man who had faced it all, prepared himself, and emerged stronger. As Alistair walked out of the courthouse on that final day, his mind drifted to the future. He imagined a quiet beach, somewhere warm and bright, with the ocean stretching endlessly before him. That's where he would go next, a place where the sound of the waves would drown out the noise of the past year. The sun and salt air would heal his mind and heart, helping him put the pieces of himself back together. All he wanted now was peace, a fresh start, and the chance to reclaim his life, free from the shadows of betrayal. Finally, he was free to do just that. 3 months later, Timothy and Becca's life together quickly unraveled. What had once been a secret affair, a brief escape from the reality of their marriages, became a suffocating daily struggle. At first, they tried to convince themselves that it would work. After all, they had been lovers for years. How different could living together really be? But the cracks began to show almost immediately. Becca, desperate to hold on to what was left of her fractured world, tried to make their home a semblance of normality, but the tension between them was palpable. The arguments started small: who left the dishes out, who didn't pick up the kids from school. But soon, they grew louder, more bitter. Every disagreement was a reminder of what they had done, of the lies they had told to their families, of the children they had betrayed. The walls of their home, once filled with laughter and promise, became the stage for constant fighting. "I can't do this anymore, Becca," Timothy shouted one evening, his hands clenched at his sides. His face was red with frustration. "You think everything's fine, that we can just go on like nothing happened. But it's not. It's not." Becca stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What do you mean? This is our life now. We're together. We'll make it work." "Make it work?" Timothy scoffed, his voice bitter. "This wasn't supposed to be our life. I didn't sign up for this. I didn't sign up to be your mistake." Becca's heart cracked as he said the words. But before she could respond, Timothy turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him with such force that it felt like the entire house shook. In the following days, the silence in the house was deafening. The children, too young to understand, could only feel the tension. Little Billy clung to Becca, his innocent face scrunched in confusion. "Why's new daddy always mad?" he asked one evening, his tiny voice trembling. Becca swallowed hard, unable to give him the answer. She had no explanation for the mess she had made, no way to soothe the hurt she had caused. Days turned into weeks, and Timothy was gone. Physically there, but emotionally absent. He paid his child support, as the court had mandated, but that was the extent of his involvement. The court had forced him to care for his biological children, but his presence in their lives felt like an obligation, not a choice. He wasn't there to help with homework or take them to the park. He didn't hear their laughter or offer a comforting word when they were upset. He just disappeared into the background of their lives. Becca tried to fill the gap, but it was impossible. The weight of her decisions, of her lies, felt crushing. Every day, she saw the pain in her children's eyes, the anger in Billy's gaze when he asked why Timothy never came to visit, the sadness in her daughter's voice when she said, "I wish we could be a family again, Mommy." There were nights Becca would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, asking herself what went wrong. She thought of the dreams she once had, of a happy family, of children growing up in a home full of love and laughter. But now those dreams felt like a cruel joke. She had destroyed everything, and there was no way to fix it. Not now, not ever. And in the silence of their broken home, she realized that her actions had stolen something from her children, something they could never get back. They would grow up without a father, without the sense of security that comes from knowing their parents are a united front. They would never experience the bond that other children had, the one that comes from a family being whole. Becca's heart broke a little more every day as she watched her kids struggle, trying to understand why the world around them had shattered. The laughter and joy that once filled their house was now replaced with an emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. In the end, Becca's choices left more than just her marriage in ruins. They tore apart the lives of 3 children, leaving them to grow up with the scars of a broken family and a mother who couldn't undo the damage she had done. 6 months later, Becca sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she stared at the phone in her lap. She had spent weeks trying to work up the courage to reach out to Alistair, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he would still want to talk. She knew she had hurt him. She knew what she had done. But a part of her still clung to the hope that they could find some form of understanding, even if it was just as friends. Taking a deep breath, she dialed his number and pressed the phone to her ear, her heart racing with every second that ticked by. The phone rang twice before Alistair's voice came through, calm but distant. "Hello?" Becca swallowed, trying to steady her voice. "Alistair, I've been thinking a lot about everything. I know I've hurt you. I know I made mistakes. But I just wanted to talk. I need you to know I'm sorry for everything." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Becca could hear Alistair exhale, and it felt like he was preparing himself for something difficult. When he finally spoke, his tone was cold, detached. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about, Becca," Alistair said, his voice flat. "You made your choices, and I made mine. I don't have the energy to revisit all of that." Her chest tightened, and she fought the urge to plead with him, to make him understand how much regret she felt. "Alistair, please, I just want to apologize. For everything. I know I can't change the past, but No, Becca," Alistair interrupted, his voice growing firmer. "You don't get to come back and rewrite history. I'm not that person anymore. I've moved on." Becca felt her heart shatter at his words. She had always known he was strong, but hearing him say it like that, so final, so resolute, hit her harder than she expected. "I've moved on, Becca. I'm married now," Alistair continued, his words blunt but undeniably clear. "I've built a new life, and I don't want anything to do with you. Not now, not ever." The words hung in the air, suffocating her. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. She had no response, no justification. She was just empty. After a moment, Alistair spoke again, quieter this time. "Goodbye, Becca. I hope you find peace." And just like that, the line went silent. Becca slowly lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen in disbelief. The reality of what had just happened sank in, and the weight of it crashed over her like a wave. There was no second chance, no forgiveness, no way back. Alistair was gone from her life, and in a way, he always had been. She had destroyed that connection long ago, and now, there was nothing left but the painful consequences of her own actions. She sat there, alone in her car, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the full force of her loneliness. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.